Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite para todos. I'm going to speak in Portuguese, but I'm going to project the text in English so you can read or listen to me. Bem-vindos à segunda sessão do segundo ano do ciclo de encontros Gender Studies and Classical Scholarship, organizado pelo EuGeStA, como parte do projeto Estudos de Gênero e estudos clássicos acadêmicos, né? EuGeStA é uma rede europeia de estudos de gênero na antiguidade que foi fundada pela professora Jacqueline Fabre-Serris, uma latinista da Universidade de Lille, em 2009. Essa rede traz professores, pesquisadores de várias áreas de estudo da antiguidade, incluindo estudos de linguagem, literatura, arqueologia, economia, direito, medicina, filosofia, história da arte, história da religião e estudos de recepção, que compartilham um interesse comum em estudos de gênero. Em 2011, foi inaugurado, né, foi criado uma revista acadêmica aberta, que é editada pela professora Jacqueline e professora Judith Hallett, do College Park, Maryland. Mais informações sobre todo o projeto podem ser encontradas no website da rede EuGeStA. Numa nova fase desta rede de pesquisa, foi criado o ciclo de encontros, que está agora no seu segundo ano. O objetivo desse projeto é disseminar publicações importantes na área de estudos de gênero a cada 2 meses. E as 4 sessões no último ano, né, que foram gravadas, elas podem ser acessadas no canal do YouTube do projeto, bem como a primeira sessão desse ano. As sessões seguem uma mesma estrutura, sempre. São 5 minutos de uma introdução feita por mim, com informações gerais sobre também os palestrantes, e depois cada palestrante apresenta seu livro e tem 15 minutos para fazer isso. E depois os respondentes ou comentadores têm 10 minutos cada um para fazerem seus comentários. E no final temos cerca de 25 minutos para uma discussão geral entre apresentadores e o público. Então, essa sessão é prevista para durar 1 hora e 20 minutos, que podem ser estendidos por 10 minutos, se necessário. Eu não vou ser draconiana, mas espero que possamos todos, cooperativamente, né, cumprir os horários. Essa é uma atividade multilingüe. O inglês é a linguagem mais comum usada pelos palestrantes e também os respondentes, mas todos são bem-vindos para falar na sua linguagem preferida, francês, espanhol, italiano, português. A única coisa que nós pedimos é que um texto em inglês seja projetado. Com esse formato, nós acreditamos que estimulamos as interações entre um número maior de participantes e damos visibilidade ao trabalho de várias partes do mundo. Eu chamo a atenção para o fato de que os respondentes, durante a fala, eles vão acentuar algum aspecto importante do livro em questão. Não é uma análise detalhada como um review de um livro. Nessa sessão de hoje, nós temos 2 livros publicados no último ano. O primeiro, Immaculate Forms, Uncovering the History of Women Bodies, publicado pela Profile Books em 2025 e foi escrito pela professora Helen King, professora emérita de Estudos Clássicos na Open University, e um nome reconhecido nos estudos de gênero e estudos clássicos. A respondente é Laurance Totelin, professora da Universidade de Cardiff, que é também historiadora da ciência, tecnologia e medicina no mundo greco-romano. O segundo livro é Ancient Roman Literary Gardens, Gender, Genre and Geopolitics, publicado pela Oxford 2025 por Sara Myers, que é professora de estudos clássicos da Universidade de Virgínia e autora de Ovid's Calls, e também tem um comentário sobre Ovidio Metamorphoses 14. A respondente é Carole Newlands, que é do Departamento de Estudos Clássicos da Universidade de Colorado Boulder. E as principais áreas de pesquisa dela é a poesia augustiniana e pós-augustiniana. E ela também tem muitos interesses em poesia antiga e medieval. Antes de eu passar a palavra às palestrantes, eu gostaria de agradecer a Sofia Moraes e Caio Franco Assunção, estudantes de mestrado em Filosofia e Letras da Universidade Federal de Minas Gerais, onde eu também atuo, pelo apoio técnico. E mais uma vez agradeço à professora Romi por coorganizar esse evento. Então, eu passo agora a palavra para a primeira palestrante. I give the floor now to Helen King. Thank you very much, Helen. You are very welcome.
Thank you very much. And yeah, let's hope this is actually going to work. It's wonderful to be speaking to you, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you in particular for those who are giving the technical help. Now, let's see if this is going to work. Oops. Okay, is that working all right for you? Somebody nod to me and look encouraging. Is that okay? Good.
It is, Helen.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I never have faith in these technologies. I decided to talk to you today from the point of view of a trade book, not an academic book, because this is the first trade book I have published, a book for the general reader. So using my knowledge of classics and classical tradition, but making it accessible to people who know nothing about the ancient world. That's quite a challenge. There are currently 3 versions of the book. This does not happen with academic publications. Going from left to right, we start with the original hardback UK. In the middle, the hardback America. The large one on the right, paperback UK. And you can see immediately that there is a different approach to history. In the first version, the UK hardback, we have an inside image of the female body, an anatomical image, decorated with clitoris flowers. That's a brilliant piece of design, but for the American audience, it was considered not appropriate. So instead, the subtitle changes, uncovering the history of women's bodies, history of the female body in 4 parts, and we have the 4 parts on the screen suggested. I find it rather strange to have my name at the top there, Helen King, over an ancient Greek statue, but I'm sure people find that entertaining. For the paperback version, same thing, but a little bit more ancient. We have the mosaic image for the abdomen or for the womb. So very different ways of presenting one story. Classics is more obvious in the paperback UK version. Classics is less obvious in the others, I think. Then we have the interesting issue. Oh, this is good. Yep. Then we have the interesting issue of where does a trade book go? Now, there are many places that have reviewed this book, but my favorite is Socialist Worker. Obviously, you know, a left-wing, quite political journal. This is the short version. There is a much longer one online, and they love it. I find this quite extraordinary, but rather exciting. So this one shows that once you write for a general audience, once you write a trade book, you travel into places that you would never normally reach with your research. So interesting, just looking at the summary there, the 4 areas of the body, breasts, clitoris, hymen, womb. Interestingly, nothing describing the clitoris in this short version, but at least it's mentioned. The book deep dives into medical and religious contexts and the frightening influence that each has had on the other. Frightening, an interesting word, again, showing something about how a general audience approaches a book. A good review, thank you very much to Socialist Worker, but showing just how far a trade book can go. Now, that medical and religious contexts is something which has become very significant in the book. So, very important in a trade book to take a clear line, to make it clear to a general reader confronted with the history of the human body, the female body, over many, many centuries, to give them a clear story. So the clear story of this book is that religion and medicine work together as gatekeepers of the female body. The image here, which is in the UK versions, but not the American version of the book, I apologize to the American audience, is an image from the 16th century in which Adam and Eve come to consult Christ, the apothecary, for a prescription to cure their original sin. The juxtaposition of medicine and religion in this picture, I think, is highly significant. Of course, there are links in the history of Western medicine about links between sin and disease, and many different links between religion and healing. But for me, this picture is the key one. So, big issue for a general audience, get it across, in my case, get it across that medicine and religion work together, sometimes in terrifying ways. I mean, there is an element of frightening, which you saw in that previous review, particularly in 19th century London, where there was a doctor who used clitoridectomy to cure women of a range of diseases and had the Church of England supporting him. The other clear line I want to draw in the book is between difference and similarity. Are women and men different, or are they essentially similar? One of the key images here is the very famous image of Vesalius from 1543 on the fabric of the human body, which brings together bodies, medicine, and religion through a dissection scene, a dissection of a woman's body. And here, the line between medicine and religion is probably unexpected, because one of the purposes of 16th century dissection was to show how great God's creation is. So this was not primarily for medical reasons, partly obviously for medical reasons, and it's partly to show whether ancient medicine is correct or not, but it's also about showing that God is amazing and that human beings are the most amazing thing of all. So it's a surprising image for a reader because we think we understand this picture. It's medical, it's medicine, but actually it is also religion. And even the setting of these anatomy images is often within a church building. I also want to get across to readers the complexity of evidence. So these two images are put together in the book because they are superficially so similar. You'll probably know the image on the right, votive image of the breasts from Paros. Aura, daughter of Diophanes, dedicated this to mark her vow to Eileithyia. We don't know what the dedication was for, whether it was for breastfeeding, for producing milk, or whether it was some condition of her breasts other than that. But it is so superficially similar to the image on the left, which is Sarah Goodridge in 1828, making an image on a small piece of ivory, only 6 by 8 centimeters, and sending this to a member of the US Senate, Daniel Webster, who'd commissioned her to paint his portrait. He was a widower. This is clearly an unusual image to send to somebody, an image of your own breasts. And the Metropolitan Museum describes it as a proto-sext, which I think is rather wonderful. So trying to get across to readers from a general background that just because two things look the same does not mean that they have the same meaning. And that's a big historical point. And I think big historical points are what you want to communicate in a trade book. I also want to communicate the longevity of some of the classical stories around bodies. This again from the chapter on breasts. It's an image from the 1820s of Evander and Euphrasia, the daughter feeding her imprisoned father, or her imprisoned husband, depending on the story. This is known as the Grecian daughter story. There's also the Roman charity story, which is very similar. These are images which reflect a range of popular stories from the ancient world. Originally, Pero feeds her father Myco in prison. These are images of the daughter or the daughter feeding the parent. They're a reversal of the normal pattern of father and child, but they're also on the boundary between sex and nurture. In plays based on this story, which were very popular in the 19th century, often the actual breastfeeding, the feeding of the father by the child, is not shown on screen. But here, in an object which would be bought to be displayed in an ordinary house, this image is shown in full. The sort of shock potential of the breast. This, in turn, I link in the book to the religious imagery of the breastfeeding Virgin Mary, the Virgo lactans. This is a very old image. I think the one on the left is from the 13th century. It's a very popular image, especially in Italy in the 13th century. There is often a theological reason behind this. Mary's breasts are shown, but often the point is that Jesus is fully human. Jesus takes milk like every baby takes milk. But that becomes something else in the middle image, where we have St. Bernard being given the power to preach by a direct jet of milk from the Virgin Mary's breast. The power of breast milk is found even today on the internet. You can find recipes for curing eye infections using breast milk. And there's a whole series of connections between blood and milk, in which babies are made of blood. Blood becomes milk. Milk is then taken by the baby. In the case of Christ, the baby's blood, when he is then crucified, is then given to believers to drink. So there's quite a complicated set of different things going on. So there can be a theological reason here. Jesus takes milk, therefore Jesus is human, as well as fully divine. But there are other things, other stories going on here as well. The next little thing I want to concentrate on in terms of how the book works and how I think a trade book works is the image of words. Words, etymology, meaning. The illustration here is from a quilt made by a women's group, Shoreditch Sisters, who created this as a project to raise awareness of female genital mutilation, of cutting. In describing what the women did when they made this, there was great confusion between vagina and vulva. Women writing, we spent the day making vaginas, and then saying, no, wrong word. No, we made vulvas. And to me, that illustrates the issue around knowing the right words for parts of our bodies and the importance of us knowing what those words are and knowing how to use those words properly. So I'm trying to use the book to raise awareness of our lack of knowledge of our own bodies and our lack of knowing the right words for our own bodies. But also the question, what is a right word? What do we use medical words from Latin and Greek? Do we use more ordinary words? Do we use imagery? So do we use imagery which suggests the beauty of the female body, for example? I talk a lot in the book about the imagery of flowers, fruit, natural world, and how that's often been used for the female body. And finally, wombs. Wombs and knowledge. So at the top you have the model used in training midwives in the 18th, 19th century. Very disturbing image to us because it looks like a woman, but with a hole in the middle. The image in the center from William Hunter is illustrations of stages of pregnancy and birth, 18th century. Here, no sign of the woman's identity, no face, no head, just a very large womb, apparently reading a book. And on the top right, terracotta wombs from the Roman world, raising the question, are these wombs? Are these container organs, as Rebecca Fleming has suggested, multi-purpose container organs? That could be a womb, they could be a belly, they could be a bladder. How do we know that those are wombs? So, as with the earlier slides, there is a sense here of trying to introduce to general readers a bigger question. What do we represent the body as looking like inside? Are these equivalent in some way? How are these images used? So I really want my reader to come away thinking long history, ancient Greeks to the present day, but asking questions all along about evidence, about the big questions, so difference versus similarity, medicine working with religion, and all those big questions about how do we know what people in the past thought about their bodies, but also how does that help us now to think about our own bodies today and about women's bodies in particular. So I think that will do for now, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Laurance has to say. Thank you. I've got to unshare, haven't I?
Thank you very much, Helen. Now I give the floor to Sara to present the book, and after the two presentations, then you have the respondents. Sara, please. Thank you very much for coming too.
Thank you. Thank you, Jacqueline, for inviting me. Thank you to the organizers and Carole for agreeing to give a commentary. Everybody can hear me? That was fascinating. Thank you. And I don't have anything visual other. Here's the book. That's my visual. It's always disappointing when you have a talk on gardens and there aren't any pictures, so I apologize. What I set out to do in my book was to examine the representation of gardens in Latin literature, primarily of the first centuries BCE and CE, trying to find connections and commonalities between them and to interrogate the ways in which literary gardens relate to actual gardens. I have suggested that the categories of gender, genre, and geopoetics provide a broad approach for analyzing this wide range of texts and for tracing their connections. Through a series of close readings, I explore the function of garden descriptions in terms of their generic and literary codes and models, their gender constructions, and the ways in which garden descriptions function within the narrative structures of texts and reflect metapoetically on the work itself. This is a work primarily of literary analysis. My goal was to gain a better understanding of the choice of representing a garden and the implications this choice of space has for understanding a given text through an investigation of the literary and cultural background of Roman gardens. Gardens appear in some form in nearly all genres of Latin literature: history, satire, epigram, epic, letters, lyric poetry, elegy, the novel, and often edge their way into larger socioeconomic and political discussions about Roman identity, gender, wealth, and land use. I argue that within these texts, generic conventions, artistic aims, and rhetorical strategies largely determine the ways in which gardens are depicted. As a space wherein nature itself is presented as a work of art, gardens often function metapoetically, as powerful symbols of the text itself, of the author's poetics and self-positioning, both in the literary tradition and in society. They invite the reader to consider the rhetorical and symbolical values of their ornamental schemes as self-reflexive spatialized models of the text. Authors also exploit the liminalities and closures the bounded garden space embodies in their textual strategies. As cultivated landscapes, however, gardens also should be understood as cultural and social constructions, which implicates them in discourses about gender, ethics, power, economics, and national character. The role of the garden in strategies of elite male self-representation followed essentially two models. One associated with the productive hortus and a frugal and traditional Roman lifestyle, which could be assimilated to philosophical self-sufficiency. The other with the larger grounds of the villa and horti that express power, culture, and wealth in line with the traditional prestige associated with land ownership. If associated with luxury or leisure, however, gardens can signify a slide towards effeminacy. Women in gardens tend to be sexualized, ripe for sex, marriage, or rape, or menstruating, or engaging in erotic magic. They usually fall into two opposing categories. They are either young virgins at a liminal stage before marriage, who are identified with the cultivated plants in an enclosed garden, or they are women who themselves attempt to enter or control the garden, in which case they are depicted as sexually voracious gender deviants. Female garden ownership can represent an uncomfortable appropriation of an important indicator of masculine power, whether political, as in Tacitus's portrayal of imperial women, or literary, see Horace's Canidia. These differing depictions are often determined by literary genre. The Virgin Bride is found enclosed within the garden, nurtured and protected in early Greek lyric and tragedy, a tradition followed by Catullus and Ovid, while the sexually rapacious woman is depicted as an intruder in priapic and satiric poetry, Scoptic epigram, and in the polemical and political narratives of Cicero, Procalio, and Tacitus. In the masculinist constructions of the female in Latin literature, within the space of the garden, women are often associated with the plants and nature. They are cultivated, not cultivators. The identification of the garden as a site in Roman culture and literature involves distinguishing it as a particular type of landscape in contrast to others. This distinction is important for art and literature since, as Anne Kuttner has argued, the Romans themselves cared passionately about categorical distinctions between the wild, the cultivated field, the garden, and the city. To blur these obscures the emotional impact of any one category or their combination and vitiates any historical investigation of Roman representational genres. How does one find gardens in Latin literature? A search for the term hortus, its diminutive hortulus, and the plural horti was my basic beginning strategy. The singular hortus is usually identified with the basic, humble produce garden, but it can also have decorative elements. Hortulus, the diminutive form, is usually a garden with philosophical associations or simply a small garden or a term of affection, while horti can be either hortus in the plural or a term that signifies a large peri-urban estate, which would have had extensive grounds and gardens. Nicholas Purcell offers a functional definition of these suburban horti, quote, deriving from the ordinary word for market gardens, it identifies a certain sort of property on the edge of cities and certainly involves an elaborate cultural deformation or appropriation of that term when used to embrace a huge range of meanings within the domain of elite property management, from the practical to the highly aesthetic. Pliny the Elder complained, now indeed under the name of gardens people possess within the city itself fields and villas for their delectation. thus appropriating the Roman moral ideals of the traditional kitchen garden for their projects of elitist personal displays of power. The ancient Roman garden developed with and as part of these estates, and literary discussions about the two, especially in the context of the criticism of wealth and leisure, occur in tandem. I follow current convention in treating the grounds of these large estates as gardens. The recent book, Gardens of the Roman Empire, Cambridge 2018, moreover, should make clear the multiple types of what are called today ancient Roman gardens, ranging from those in the domus and villa to produce and flower gardens, temple garden precincts, sacred groves, gardens and baths, palaestrae, gymnasia, schools, and tomb gardens. A literary garden might also be evoked merely by a list of plants, flowers, or vegetables. Garden history has greatly benefited from recent broad interdisciplinary approaches and new theoretical perspectives, such as spatial and gender studies. This scholarship has underlined the importance of space and place in ancient texts, the investment of places with meaning, and how the representation of landscape in literature connects to cultural practices and also contributes to them. This preoccupation with space has yielded a variety of interpretive frameworks, such as status, socioeconomic identity, gender, differential or preferential access, architectural form and function, and the relationship between ancient literary sources and archaeology. The relationship between literary and real gardens deserves to be probed, at the very least because such spaces are created by the ways we talk about them. While the research of historians, art historians, garden archaeologists, and philologists all rely on each other in order to understand the many cultural, ideological, and imaginative associations of the Roman garden, there are difficulties involved in reconciling the material remains with the ancient written descriptions of gardens. Garden archaeology has revealed many of the plantings and the hard and soft landscaping of ancient gardens. Villas, their multimedia decorative assemblages, and their landscapes were imaginative constructions which evoked and even recreated mythic and other spaces into which the viewer could enter the fantasy and participate in its reenactment, thereby alighting, as Kathleen Coleman has argued, the distance between the fictive and the actual for people inhabiting these spaces. Real gardens fulfilled a wide range of functions, ranging from the practical to the religious and social. Study of their sculptures, architecture, and paintings can shed light on the owner's imaginative conception of their garden. The frequent appearance of busts of philosophers in gardens coincides with their literary associations. Priapic figures are also shared by literary and real gardens. However, the frequent appearance of Bacchic, theatrical, and Egyptian imagery in excavated gardens finds little reflection in literature. Our surviving literary sources also have very little to say about the numerous religious functions of actual Roman gardens. Literary aims take precedence over the realities of horticulture or climate, just as garden frescoes may have derived more from artists' compositional habits than from landscape design. Very few of our literary sources purport to be describing actual gardens, and even those that do, such as Cicero, Pliny the Younger, Columella, Statius, rely heavily on the literary tradition, have rhetorical goals specific to their contexts, and are dense with literary allusion. What garden owners and authors have most in common is the exploitation of the garden as a space for self-fashioning. Just a summary of the book. Chapter 1 looks at texts, both prose and poetry, that at least purport to deal with real gardens, that is, horti, the large grounds associated with wealthy estates. Beginning with Cicero and ending with Pliny the Younger, this chapter offers a chronological investigation of the ways in which real and literary gardens developed from the 1st century BCE to the 1st century CE as a means of elite masculine self-representation, and the reactions of wealthy Romans to the increased social and cultural power of the villa and horti. Chapter 2 presents Virgil's famous garden passage in Georgics 4 as a literary paradigm for interpreting the Roman garden and as an important model for later Roman authors. The many and varied ancient and modern interpretations of this complex passage illustrate well the numerous potential associations of male gardening: literary, aesthetic, ethical, philosophical, and political. A complex literary tradition seems to lie behind many of the elements in Virgil's description, which suggests that the garden serves as a metapoetic symbol of his poetic task and as a statement of his literary affiliations. Horticulture is presented in a praeteritio, which highlights its special status within the agricultural world and raises questions about its relationship to the rest of the poem in terms of genre and content. The garden embodies a number of unresolved tensions in the Georgics as a whole, between the bucolic and Georgic, labor and leisure, humans, and the natural world. Chapter 3 looks at how Catullus and Ovid engage with the Greek literary motif of the protected and premarital virginal garden, primarily found in lyric poetry and tragedy. These passages place women in the center of the garden. Catullus, in his two wedding poems, 61 and 62, borrows the earlier Greek image of the virgin bride as a cultivated and protected flower in a male-owned garden, and uses it to explore gender tensions involved in sex and marriage. Ovid, on the other hand, in his two extensive garden passages centering on the Italian goddesses Flora in the Fasti and Pomona in the Metamorphoses, exploits the traditional literary female garden paradigms of both virginity and fertile sexuality, while reversing typical gender roles. Ovid's garden passages complement each other and exploit the boundaries of the garden for narratological and metapoetical aims. The garden makes more appearances in Latin satiric and epigrammatic literature than in any other genre. Its humble nature, association with simple food and bodily functions, and relationship with the garden god Priapus, who, as Amy Richland has argued, is the minatory figure that stands at the center of the whole complex of Roman sexual humor, make it suitable to the lower genres of satire and epigram. Chapter 4 examines a wide range of satiric texts in which the idealized visions of rustic life associated with the garden, whether those of the hoary old Roman tradition or Alexandrian programmatics, are spoofed and dirtied. The hypermasculine priapic pose exploits the boundary of the garden to define metaphorically a space that is male, obscene, and exclusionary. Female incursion into this space is portrayed as a threat to the male control over the garden, and women become the target of Priapus's invective, while men who enter the priapic garden are effeminized through suffering penetration. These texts share the strategies of undermining ethical, gendered, and generic pretensions by using rustic settings and lowly characters to debase and mock idealized literary and moralizing versions of the countryside and the garden. This chapter includes Horace's satires, Latin epigram collections, Martial and the Carmen of Priapea, Petronius's Satyricon, and the varied poetic collection of the Virgilian Appendix, including the Copa Moratum and the Priapea. Chapter 5 finally takes as its subject Columela's dual treatment of horticulture and poetry and prose in his agricultural treatise Res Rustica. Columela's two treatments of gardens allow him to explore in an innovative manner two different modes of horticultural teaching, as well as traditions of garden literature. The dual associations of the garden with pleasure and utility offered Columela a powerful metaphor for reflecting on the nature of didactic poetry. While his poem serves to demonstrate his literary skill and learning, the prose supplement shows that it is a superior medium for agricultural instruction. In conclusion, my book attempts to show that garden spaces in literature function in ways that are important to an understanding of the aesthetic and ethical values of a given literary work. I've tried to avoid overgeneralizing the complex ways in which ancient Roman authors use garden descriptions for their literary aims. As the numerous recent studies of Roman gardens have shown, gardens in Latin literature can be, among other things, heterotopic, transgressive or normative, transformative, or marginalized. Rather than imposing one interpretive scheme on all these horticultural passages, my goal has been to interpret them individually and through close literary analysis to consider how they contribute to an understanding of each of these complex ancient literary works. If anything unites all these different texts, it is perhaps the ability of the garden, both real and imaginative, to convey something about its owner/author in their manipulation of their natural environment in a well-defined space. As an enclosed and cultivated space, the garden is suitable for definition and is often constitutive of the gender, genre, and aesthetic aims of the author. Gardens are good to think with because they provide spaces for exploring the limits and aims of human intervention in nature, the relationship between nature and art, and their boundaries can enact generic social and gender distinctions through inclusion and exclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now you have the first respondent, Laurance Totelin.
Yes.
Please.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to say first that the two books go very well together because there is a lot, of course, about plants in Helen's book and a lot of about sexuality in Sara's book. So Helen, thanks very much for giving us a very brief summary of your book. And what I really enjoyed was an insight into some of the decisions that you have made. I hadn't prepared anything before coming here, so I've just taken some notes and I'll work through them. So the book, as you have explained, is uncovering the female body, and it goes from the most visible, which is the breasts, to the most invisible, which is the womb, passing by the clitoris and the hymen. I found this organization to be amazing because it decentered the womb, which is so prominent in all discussions of womanhood, ancient and modern. And you know, my mother, and I hope she won't mind me saying this, when she had a hysterectomy, was told by her doctor in Latin, which she could understand, tota mulier in utero, which is of course deeply insulting. So that organization is really beautiful, really thought-provoking, and I'll come back to some aspects of that in a second. You talked about the clear lines that you had, which were to delineate things around the religion and medicine, and talk about difference and similarity. And I hope you won't mind me saying this, but to me, one of the clearest lines you had here, and one for which I think many people might be very grateful, is how you were very clear in almost every single word, every single sentence, how supportive you were of the LGBTQIA community. It's extremely clear, and yet you're not situating yourself among some of the huge debates. This is your line, and there's no real debate, and you show how historically it makes no sense to be essentialist around what is a woman and how the definition of womanhood has changed over time, and that biology, medicine had various ways of defining this. And of course, this has been a theme in all your scholarship, but here you present it to the general public. And you do it through a huge array of evidence, and you've presented some of this evidence to us today, and you've shown examples that are very early from the 5th century BCE and some that are very modern, like this tapestry of vulvas, but there's so much in between. It's extraordinary and so beautifully illustrated as well. Knowing how hard it can be to source images, I admire this a lot, and through very so all this wealth of evidence, you are, as you say, showing that sometimes things can look similar across time but do not convey the same meaning, which was, so well done. And there is a lot of evidence, but it never, at least to me, never felt overwhelming. It always felt really engaging. So another thing you discussed today is that one of the main themes is knowing. So knowing one's body and ways of knowledge. And I think that this book, and I know you have a very broad readership, but I hope a lot of women will read it and discover things about their own bodies. So you point out that there's difficulties around labeling vulva, vagina. Perhaps that's important, perhaps that's not so important. You talk, of course, about the clitoris and how a very large proportion of people still today cannot point to the clitoris on a model or on a representation. But here I really like the discussion of hymen, because, and I have to confess that I'm going to talk a bit about myself here. I always thought that it was a given, that it was a reality. So thank you for doing that. I just, you show how slippery it is, and how and you really describe how there is no real way to know through medical observation whether someone is a virgin or not. And I'll just finish for the last 2 minutes on the different versions, because I was sent the version that is on sale at the welcome. It has this absolutely stunning illustration. I'm really sorry that not everyone has that cover. I know it's a common practice in trade publishing, but it's such a beautiful thing. That and it has the flowers, the plants. I think it's really evocative, and I yes, I can see how you would prefer not to have statues. So I don't have the American version to compare, and maybe if you could tell us a little bit more about how it was decided to have different material, different illustrations, the choices. Some seem to be a little bit ideological, a little bit based in some views of religion. And perhaps the final thing I'll say is that on the cover, so on the jacket that I have here, you say that your role within the Church of England, and I think that's another huge theme in the volume. And I hope, I don't know if it's been reviewed by Church Time or things like that. I hope it will, if it's not been already, because it really gives a view of what churches and religious groups can be, how you can have faith, and you can work within a church and have views of womanhood, personhood, biology that are not oppressive, that are that offer liberation. So thank you very much. I was really delighted to read the book and to be a respondent today.
Thank you very much, Laurance. Now our second respondent, Carole Newlands, please.
Am I muted?
Yeah.
I am. Okay.
You're not muted. I can
Oh,
hear
I'm
you.
not muted. Oh, am I muted now? Okay. All right. I can't hear you now, but never mind. Okay. All right, Sara, thank you so much for this book, and thank you so much for that rich overview. So I really don't know where to begin now, because I feel you've covered so much with your introduction to your book. But reading your book and listening to your presentation did raise some general comments and some questions. So I'd like to offer some general comments and a couple of close readings as possible supplements that you may or may not like. Sorry, I'm getting a message that I'm speaking in Portuguese, but I don't think I am I? Good, okay. All right, so I think this is really a work of impressive scholarship in terms of the breadth and quality of the literary and historical research. I love the fact that you show the connection with Greek literary texts. You take us as far as the Appendix Virgiliana, which is wonderful and fascinating. And I also think you do a brilliant job of disentangling the thickets of critical discussion around these garden texts, often contradictory. You do a great job. So I think I would have liked to have read more discussion of geopoetics, because that's the third part of your title. But the concept is discussed only briefly in the introduction. The term was coined by the Scottish poet and ecologist Kenneth White, who writes that geopoetics provides a place where all kinds of specific disciplines can converge to address the current state of the earth. So I wonder, therefore, if you could have, I know the book is long, but if there could have been more interdisciplinary reach, not just to ecological concerns, but for instance, to the tradition of Roman garden wall painting, which has its own particular visual rhetoric. For instance, the Villa of Livia, which you mention, I wonder if these paintings or this painting could not have been brought into the discussion of texts as a central part of the visual culture of the Roman writer. Also, garden wall paintings often complement actual gardens themselves, while offering strong parallels with literary representations in their play with illusion and also their insistence on boundaries, fences, and so on. However, when you do contemplate the famous garden fresco of the House of Livia, it seems to me there's two striking differences from literary representations. One is, as you observe, garden frescoes don't generally include people, and there aren't any people there. Instead, there are many birds flying around. I believe Bettina Bergman, or maybe you, identify 70 species of birds in a not very large space. So stepping into this fabulous garden room, one would not only see the lush abundance of the garden, but imaginatively hear a chorus of songbirds. So the fresco could also be a conversation piece where viewers, diners could try to identify the huge variety of plant and bird life. Attention to bird knowing and identifying can be a form of conservation too. And yet there's very little attention to bird song in Roman literary representations, even though, as you make clear, descriptions of gardens are often to be understood metapoetically as symbolic of the poet's creative practice. So this seems to me a conundrum and leads to the question of why it might be the case that wall paintings invite us to imagine birdsong, whereas most literary representations are focused on the plant life or the animal life on sight, not sound. But that could be a dead-end question, I don't know. I wonder too if you could bring the political more into your work on gardens. So I'd like to turn to the passage that you and others have suggested is possibly the most famous literary garden description in Roman literature, that of the Old Corinthian in Georgics 4. You show that to call this passage a digression is a misnomer, and you interestingly point out the closural elements in this passage, suggesting that it points to the end of the poet's labors on the Georgics. That is, that the garden functions as a metaphorical and aesthetic representation of the poet's own labor as it comes to an end. And this seems to me actually a more fruitful interpretation than the prevalent one promoted by critics such as Thomas and Cronenberg, that dismiss the garden as irrelevant to Virgil's poetic practice. But I'm wondering whether more could be done with this closural effect in connection with the naming of the old gardener as a Carytian, that is, according to Servius, a Cilician pirate who was resettled by Pompey in the 60s in Calabria. This theory is being generally dismissed, but I wonder if we couldn't see in the designation of the gardener as a war veteran a retrospective gaze back at the eclogues, which are gravely unsettled by the land confiscations. The 1st and 9th eclogues complain that farmers and tenants are having to surrender their land, their beloved land, to outsiders, to a barbarous melees. The Carytian gardener was perhaps once also a barbarous melees, but he's learned to lead an ethical life, modeling himself on the Catonian hard-working farmer. So I wonder if we can see Virgil's garden passage as creating closure not just for the Georgics, but for Virgil's poetry of the earth, that is, both eclogues and Georgics. The Georgics passage ends with umbras, which of course is the closural word that appears at the end of the 1st and last eclogue. So to repeat my question, could the passage have political as well as metapoetic significance that extends to the eclogues? But since this is a EuGeSta event, I think I should focus on the major section of your book that discusses gender. It's striking that actually most of the recent research done on gender and the garden has actually been by women, right? Including Pagan, von Stackelberg, Bergman, Jaschemski, and now yourself. My next question or thoughts relate to what you call masculine horticultural self-fashioning. And it strikes me that the owners of famous Roman literary gardens are all male, but they also are all old, a circumstance that seems as odd with the fecundity of a garden. Cicero's Cato is a senex, right? The Carytian farmer is a senex. Statius's villa owners are retired and old. In Eclogue 1, Melibæus addresses Tityrus as a Fortunati senex. I would argue that Tityrus owns a garden, for we are told his plot of land is bounded by a hedge that needs to be trimmed. So why do these literary representations of what you call masculine horticultural self-fashioning associate ownership of at least ideal gardens with old men? This surely emphasizes at least the garden's exclusivity as well as also its temporality. But is there anything else going on here? Now I'd like to turn to a fascinating section on women in the garden. It seems to me that the locus aemonis, a pleasant place in the outdoors, is always dangerous, particularly to beautiful youth. But in the section of women, you show that the cultivated, bounded garden is also far from a safe place for the young and beautiful, for the garden is associated with both the erotic and the virginal, and represents a fragile, permeable place, its flowers and fruits easily plucked or trampled. When you turn to discuss the two Roman goddesses of gardens, Pomona and Flora, and bring together the two different genres of epic and ideological elegy, the contrast with this feminine stereotype of virginal passivity is striking, for both Pomona and Flora defy this convention. Pomona is no shrinking violet, so to speak. As you show, she puts up a stout resistance to invasion of her space by the shape-shifting god Vertumnus, and she's an efficient gardener. Ovid says this is her amor, her passion, not sex. As you emphasize, Sara, gender roles are inverted here, but they're also, to some extent, surely also made ambiguous, or maybe we should even say destabilized. As you point out, Pomona doesn't follow Diana as many resolute virgins do. Her nurturing of plants is described as maternal. We're told at line 626 in Metamorphoses 14 that no one was more attentive of the tree's fetus, of the tree's offspring, a maternal image. But then her work 2 lines later in the garden is also coded as masculine because she handily wields the sickle, which of course is the tool of Priapus. So I wonder if you could have perhaps also not just compartmentalized satire here, but brought something in from satire at this point, and with your wonderful treatment of Priapus in the satiric text. At any rate, to some extent, gender norms, I think, are also inverted or maybe destabilized in the story of Flora in the Fasti. The god of the west wind, Zephyr, after raping Flora, elevates her status from nymph to goddess and gives her a garden and cosmic control over flowers as her marital dowry. As Ovid puts it in a lovely line, Flora brings color to the world. But there's surely gender ambiguity in her new role too, as Flora provides the seeds that make new flowers, and in one case helps inseminate Juno with the god Mars. There's also her close connection with Ovid, the male poet. Flora, as you point out, as you discuss, brings into being the flowers that emerge from the untimely deaths of Narcissus and Adonis, mythical events that are told in the Metamorphoses. You comment that the mention of these flowers makes Flora's garden an unhappy place. But I see them as reinforcing the important metapoetic connection of Flora and Ovid in the Fasti, an elegiac poem. So color can mean also rhetorical coloring. Flora, we are told, has written an elegiac lament upon the hyacinth. So like Ovid, she's also an inventive, creative, elegiac poet. So she hovers between the masculine and the feminine. I really like how you show the engagement of Pomona and Flora between these two stories across different genres. How this basic garden paradigm of the violated virginal garden is overturned, or at least modified, played with in these two narratives. But I also find it disturbing that both ancient Roman goddesses, who had the honor of flamens, special priestesses, became subjected to sexual violence. So my last questions are, what kind of model of Roman womanhood do these goddesses offer? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carole. Now we pass to Helen to answer Laurance, and after this to Sara to answer Carole.
Thank you, and thank you, Laurance. That was a lovely summary, and it's really always so interesting to hear what people think. People who've actually looked at the book from all sorts of backgrounds. So a couple of the things I wanted to say were, when you were talking about hoping that women would use this book to find out about their bodies, the hymen chapter had a response on Goodreads, which I emphatically insist on reading all the time to see what ordinary readers think. Someone on Goodreads said, I read the chapter on the hymen and I still don't know whether it exists or not. That was my point. I wanted to create that level of doubt so that the range from the imperforate hymen that will simply not break without surgical intervention to hymens that just don't seem to be there at all, to membranes that disappear without a trace and no one even realizes they've gone. That is quite a spectrum. And I wanted to problematize that. So that was really interesting. What you asked about the contrast between the US and the UK versions, I found this, as many things were, a revelation about doing trade publishing. I had no idea I would have to go through the proofs of the American version with the same care as I went through the UK version. So the US was in September last year, UK was September last year, US was January. And I was just sort of finished doing the UK version and started doing media things to launch it. So this is the other thing about doing a trade book. You're rapidly on Woman's Hour on BBC Radio, then you're on Start the Week, and then it sort of just takes off from there. So lots of media to do. I was just starting the media when the US version turns up with, here are the proofs, check them through, and they're completely different. So whole sentences have changed, like the order of the sentences reversed, or sometimes it's a simple thing where a phrase, a colloquial phrase, does not work in American English, so it's been changed. I understand that. Sometimes I really don't know why it's been changed. And then the title thing and the cover, they thought that the Americans thought that the UK title was too historical. Hello, it's a book about history. It was too historical, and that this would not appeal to readers who think history is boring. Hello, history is not boring. Read this book. So it was really difficult to get that, in a way that works. Now, I think personally the UK version is a much nicer cover. I can understand it looks a bit old-fashioned because it's got a historical image, but the publisher made a big effort to change the font of the words immaculate forms to make that look more modern, and to go for the sort of overall blue color. Originally it was red, which I liked, blood, but it moved towards being blue because that was seen as more modern. So there's lots of things going on. The US audience, correctly, the publisher wanted to make it accessible to and appealing to younger women. I like that. But they seem to think younger women would like the 4 sections approach more. I don't know. I'm not a young American woman, so I can't say. But those were the sorts of things that were going on there. And then you mentioned the Church of England role. Well, that clearly is important to me because as an activist for women's rights in the church and also for LGBTQIA+ rights, I can't divorce that from what I'm saying in this book. It was really good for me to be able to write a book which combines my academic identity as a historian of the body and my church identity as an activist for equal rights. And that for me was critical. Yes, the Church Times has published a review of my book, and they also approached me to write a 2-page article summarizing the book, which I did. And they invited me to speak at their Festival of Faith and Literature, which was a few months ago. And that was really good. So I think the Church Times has done a great job. There's also a review out there from a much more evangelical, conservative church group, which really doesn't like the book at all. What a surprise. So yeah, negotiating that, my dual identity as part of the book was one of the things that really gave me pleasure. So that's what I wanted to say in response to your questions, which were all fabulous. I also wanted to just say hello to my co-author, my co-presenter here, and say, actually, your stuff about gardens is so interesting to me because, as Laurance noticed, I do a lot on flowers in the book, and particularly the way that older images of the female body often talk about floral imagery, blossom, rosebud, and so on. But I also say that the way that's been used is often not to emphasize the beauty of the female body, but to emphasize its fragility, that you must not risk losing your bloom. Women's bloom is very transitory and will go, and then you'll be worthless and shamed in front of everybody. So that the floral imagery, the way I present it, is about beauty, but also fragility and control of women. So I find that a fascinating link between the books. So I shall stop at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Now, while Sara answers Carole, I would like to ask you, there is a question by a student, Romana, in the chat. Romana is a Brazilian master student here at my university. If you could read it and then return to you again. But now I will pass to Sara.
Thank you. Yes, responding to Helen, I mean, flowers are a huge other subject because they occur, of course, outside of the garden as well. And it's interesting to consider the difference between a wild flower and the protected flower in a garden. Thank you, Carole. There are just so many things there. I'm not sure. I will selectively respond and then take more time to think about some of the larger issues. The Garden of Livia painting is truly is just fascinating. I think that it's it's a very particular, it's the earliest example that we have. So I think I can imagine whatever they were doing down in that subterranean room, which I visited last summer for the first time. I like the idea of them sort of playing the game of identifying, because certainly in the Augustan period, this was, horticultural knowledge was very au courant. I'm not sure what they were doing, but again, I was struck myself by how little, I mean, the bird song is usually associated with the locus amoenus, and keeping the two apart, the garden and the locus amoenus, is very difficult. But I was struck by how few, despite the fact that I argue that gardens are metapoetical, people aren't usually singing in them. The only singing we have is the poor, gardener in the Moretum who's kind of humming. And then Columella makes an offhand remark about how he's writing his poems so that a gardener, can sing. Otherwise, that is not the activity usually associated with gardens. So I think that's a really interesting comment on the absence of sound. As to the sexual aspects of Pomona, I do try to bring that out, and of course her suit of Vertumnus is extremely priapic in many ways. I like the idea of not, fencing off the epic, and that is the only epic garden in Latin literature from the satiric. I think it's important that gardens, we don't emphasize the boundaries too much. The Georgics, I'm sure that you're right, but that's such a difficult passage. I pushed back though. I did push back. Emily Gowers argues that the garden is for old men, and I pushed back a little bit against that, because aside from the Cato and the Virgilian passage, obviously, all these famous owners are largely men, and they had them when they were old, but I think they also had them when they were young. So I push back a little bit on the association of gardens specifically with old men. But otherwise, certainly the male associations. I think I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Well, thank you. I mean, your book was so rich and covers so much material. It was hard to focus on what I wanted to ask you in this session. I do have a question. I know that there's several garden texts that we just know the names of from the Augustan period. Is that right? There's other horticultural writings that we know of but don't have. Is that the case?
Well, there are treatises, Kepurica, if that's what you're talking about,
Okay.
Which presumably we know in the Augustan period, these sort of books were being written that seem to be largely perhaps encyclopedic. I mean, we get the names of them from Pliny the Elder. Otherwise, no. I mean, the most intriguing lost work to me is the play, The Hortulus, that we've lost.
Yeah, that would be really interesting if we had that.
Okay. Thank you. Okay. Well, Professor King answer Romana here in the chat. I don't know if Laurance, who was mentioned here, would like to make some comment to Romana too.
Yeah, it's a very interesting comment on mine to reflect as you go through some experiences, you reflect on your body and its place in history, and of course that's something that Helen's book does beautifully, but also points the fact that you don't need to go through some experiences to have a historical understanding of them. Yes, definitely breast milk as white blood or blood as white milk. It's a really important notion historically, and it makes breast milk a very ambivalent substance because the idea is that you are drinking the blood of your mother. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that the baby human is a sort of cannibal? And so on and so forth. So it's a very interesting notion. By the way, Helen, I mean, this has really given me a wish to write a trade book. So maybe one day watch this space.
I can recommend you to my editor anytime. But no, it's very interesting. And also something which is happening in there, which I'm just aware of, is also trade book and personal book. So I didn't want to write a misery memoir. There are too many books out there already about how appallingly women have been treated by the medical profession and or by religion. Didn't want to do that, although it's true. But there are moments when I wanted to share experience. And in a trade book, that's difficult if your editor rightly is saying your position as author, it comes from your authority as a historian. So you don't want to keep losing that by going personal. But sometimes you can go personal. So it's very difficult to know when. So Laurance mentioned her mother's experience of a hysterectomy and an extraordinary use of Latin quotes to someone who's just lost their womb. Great. I also felt I needed to say a few things. So one of the things I talk about when I talk about gender and about gender assignment at birth is the point that I was originally assigned male at birth because the man who delivered me, because I was a difficult birth, of course I was difficult, the man who delivered me thought it was very funny that my mother wanted a girl. And so he therefore said, "Oh, you've got a wonderful boy." And my mother went, "Oh, no." And then he went, "Oh, just a joke." Now, that sort of, there is something there about the authority, particularly in the past. I don't think it's quite as bad now. The authority in the past of the medical expert, usually always actually male, over his power over the female body. And that is really alarming. And it needs to be said, but not necessarily in this book, maybe in another book.
Thank you. Well, you are almost on our time. I don't know if there are more questions. I don't see in the chat. Oh, just thanking Laurence. And Jacqueline, would you like to say anything? I just like say that I'm very glad that you put these two books together when you are discussing how to organize the semester, the year. And then I suggest let's put these two books together, and I think it worked very well. Thank you. Jacqueline,
Thank you very much of all of you. And it was a wonderful session. Thank you, Helen, Carole, Laurance, and Sara. Thank you very much. This was very interesting.
I don't know if Professor Zeitling, I don't know if she had, no, she had words. Okay. So, well, if there is, oh yeah, Sara, you'd like to say something? Nothing. Well, I don't know. Then if there is no more question, you could end. Thanks again for the speakers, the respondent, and all of you that were present here. I would like just to say that the record of this session are going to be put on the channel of EuGeStA, so it will be available for some people who arrive later or even who are not able to come. And we return to more session next semester with new books. So thank you again very much and see you in the next
And
time.
thank you, Cecilia, and your assistants very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone. Lovely to be here.
Thank you, Helen, Sara, Laurance.
Thank you.